Muchísimas gracias. No te vayas, no te vayas. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Sueli. Vamos con tiempo bastante justo, me he dado cuenta, por la efusión pensadora de Sueli. Entonces os voy a proponer que en lugar de que hagamos las preguntas detrás de cada presentación, las hagamos al final. Si os parece bien, si conseguimos anotar todo aquello que se nos ha ocurrido durante la presentación increíble y maravillosa de Sueli y guardamos las preguntas para el final, si os parece bien. ¿Sí? ¿Te parece bien, Sueli? Vale, y al final haremos la serie de preguntas al final. Bueno, de repente veo que Fátima ha desaparecido, pero creo que espero que sea una desaparición muy breve, que haya ido al baño y que esté volviendo. Bueno, la segunda participante de la tarde, después de esta activación generalizada de todas las fuerzas en la que nos ha puesto Sueli, la segunda participante de la tarde es Fatima El-Tayeb. Fátima es profesor de literatura y de estudios étnicos y directora del programa de estudios críticos de género en la Universidad de California en San Diego, y es también autora de varios libros, uno de los cuales os recomiendo, aunque no está traducido al castellano, se llama Otros Europeos, European Others, queerizando la etnicidad en una Europa posnacional. También es autora de un libro que ha generado un gran debate en el contexto alemán, que se llama Schwarze Deutsche, alemanes negros, raza y identidad nacional, y entre 1890 y 1933, y como os digo, fue objeto de un gran debate en Alemania, y creo que ese debate merece la pena que lo escuchemos en un contexto tremendamente sensible también a las cuestiones de identidad nacional, pero también a las cuestiones de etnicización y de producción de la otreidad, de la alteridad, de eso que Fátima llama a aquellos que son extranjeros dentro de sus propios países. Una de las razones por las que quería que Fátima estuviera aquí hoy con nosotros es porque su investigación se centra en el racismo europeo y, por tanto, sale un poco, si queréis, de esa prevención a la que nos invitaba Sueli acerca de las oposiciones tradicionales entre el norte y el sur, y, por tanto, lo que investiga el trabajo de Fatima El-Tayeb es precisamente cómo el racismo funciona, trabaja dentro de la propia sociedad y cultura europea, y por tanto investiga la posición de los cuerpos y de los sujetos racializados en el contexto de Europa, sabiendo que Europa se ha construido también con la ficción democrática, es decir, como esa gran ficción democrática dominante de la modernidad ilustrada, y por tanto cómo entender la posición de esos otros racializados en el contexto europeo, y más particularmente Fátima ha sido muy atenta en su trabajo a la invención del otro musulmán en ese contexto europeo contemporáneo. Por todas esas razones por las que quería que estuviera con nosotros hoy, ha hecho un esfuerzo para estar aquí desde California con el jet lag y todo lo demás, y me decía, espero estar suficientemente despierta para cuando me toque hablar, y espero que lo estás. Y bueno, pues muy bienvenida y gracias.
Hola. Thank you very, very much to Beatrice and Alicia and the other organizers of the event. And I also want to particularly thank the translators. I know it's a very hard job, but very necessary for me, because unfortunately my Spanish is very, very basic. So they allow me to follow what's going on here. And I'm very inspired by Sueli's talk, and maybe I'll come back to it. But there are definitely very interesting connections, I think. And I apologize in advance to the translators if I diverge from the script. I try not to do it as much as possible. Decolonizing the museum requires obviously a lot of things, including to not only decolonize Europe's gaze at the rest of the world, but also Europe's gaze at itself. So what I will be talking about are a couple of artists and activists who I believe do that, decolonize Europe's gaze or creolize or queer Europe's gaze at itself by speaking from a subject position that is constructed as impossible, namely the subject position of Europeans of color. So rather than attempting to be included into the existing narrative as proper Europeans, even though they are not white, what these artists and activists do is reject the very notion of a proper, authentic, or normal position. And while their work would not normally be found in museums, they are collectively creating alternative archives of a decolonial Europe. So I'll basically give you a couple of examples of that. And the first one is Salon Oriental, which was Berlin-based Turkish-German genderqueer drag collective. And they staged a number of plays. The one that I'll be talking about briefly was called Oriental Airlines, or How Do I Get to the Black Sea Clinic? And as usual for their performances, the site where this play was produced was not a theater, but a queer bar in Berlin's gay neighborhood. Their audience, not art lovers, but club goers. And of course, this strategy of bringing art to where the people are rather than bringing people into art spaces creates a particular dynamic, but also requires different strategies to make sure that the audience remains engaged. And the form that they often choose in their performances was burlesque, an over-the-top parody of artistic forms. But the content of their work nonetheless was highly political. In the case of Oriental Airlines, part of the inspiration for the story was the case that was very infamous in Germany in the late 90s was Mehmet, which was the name of the used name of a 14-year-old repeat offender who, like the majority of the descendants of the so-called guest workers, which had been brought to Germany and other parts of northwestern Europe, was born and raised in Europe, but did not have German citizenship, because Germany uses the law of the blood, where descent defines your nationality, not place of birth. So what that meant was that after the courts and the public court as well had decided that this guy was simply a born criminal who could not be saved, he was deported to Turkey while his parents remained in Germany. And that was something that was notorious in his case, but it's something that happened frequently and continues to happen. People are deported back to a space that they had never been in, where they often have no connections, no survival strategies, they don't even speak the language, but it's possible because of this idea that this is where they are really from. So Salon Oriental reacted to this case and the larger narrative behind it by producing this play, and I'll give you a short summary that is taken from an interview with one of the members, Fatma Suad, and she explains, I quote, "A commissioner for aliens trying to make the deportation as pleasant as possible organizes a training session. In order for you as a Deutschlander to not stand out in Turkey too much, you have to go through a little reintegration program. You will see how useful this is for you. After all, according to our files, you haven't been in Turkey for 30 years and aren't really up to date anymore." Unfortunately, the plane, Seward explains, needs to make an emergency landing, and the commissioner ends up in the Black Sea Clinic, where everything is possible from guy to girl and the other way around. That is the second topic, transgender. End of quote. So what is present here in general in Salon Oriental's self-described trash comedy are multiple references, starting with the play's title, Oriental Airlines, or How Do I Get to the Black Sea Clinic? Oriental Airlines, whose notoriously unreliable services are a metaphor for the notorious unreliability of Orientals, which is contrasted with the similarly famous supposed efficiency of Germans. At the same time, Oriental Airlines is also a riff on the very popular, cheap Turkish airlines that most Germans use to go to the Black Sea or other spaces in Turkey that are very popular holiday destinations for Germans. And finally, the Black Sea Clinic is a reference to the first massively popular German soap, which was the Black Forest Clinic, being housed in the most German space of all spaces. And this multi-referential strategy extends to the content of the play itself, which connects the peculiar legal and social state of the descendants of labor migrants with the peculiar legal and social state of trans people, suggesting that in both cases, complex reality are forcibly adjusted to an essentialist binary understanding of identity. And by making this seemingly illogical or improper connection between national and gender identity, just as in producing trash comedy instead of proper political art, and in choosing the location for their performances, Salon Oriental violates a staggering number of the dichotomies that shape the dominant heteronormative racialized understanding of Europe. In that sense, the group's terrorist Jack follows Jose Muno's definition of camp as, I quote, a strategic response to the breakdown of representation that occurs when a queer, ethnically marked, or other subject encounters his or her inability to fit within the majoritarian representational regime. It is a measured response to the forced evacuation from dominant culture that the minority subject experiences, end quote. Because they embody the unstable relationship between the supposed opposites central to our understanding of Europe, citizen, foreigner, modern, archaic, advanced, underdeveloped, secularism, Islam, enlightenment, fundamentalism, and so on, racialized Europeans are forcibly evacuated from the space they inhabit, instead defined as eternal foreigners forever failing to exhibit the qualities of proper Europeanness. I argue that Salon Oriental's radically intersectional attack on normalized notions of nation, gender, and sexuality is symptomatic for a larger network of racialized queer European artists and activists who react to their impossible positionality by deconstructing rigid notions of identity, only to reassemble them in ways that might appear nonsensical from the hegemonic perspective, but more accurately reflect their lived reality than a dominant system of normative binaries that cannot comprehend their very existence. And this is where Sueli's talk really made me think, because of this notion of, on the one hand, repetition and reproduction, and on the other, diversification, because it seems to me maybe what these queer European artists of color do is something in between, namely a kind of repetition that produces something new. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, one of the art forms that is particularly central to this group is hip-hop. And of course, repetition is key to hip-hop, right? That's a central element. You take a note, a sound, a sequence, a harmony, and then you repeat it on a loop. But it doesn't remain the same. But the thing is, you don't really know when it stops to be the same and becomes something new, when it's still the old, and when it has morphed into something new, which is part of why hip-hop is an art form that really violates notions of authorship, of originality, of authenticity, because it's all about taking things, appropriating them, and then making something new, but making something new in a circular motion. You don't take the old thing, transform it, and then you have the new thing in a linear movement. You have the repetition of something, and then you suddenly realize, wait, that is not the same anymore, but when did that happen? And I think that is very much representative of this kind of dealing with identity of artists like Salon Oriental and others, which highlights the differentials of power produced by a European discourse of belonging that tends to work very binary by pitting especially racial against sexual minorities. So a central discourse is the tension between a Muslim community imagined as homogeneously straight and a queer community imagined as homogeneously white. And what it erases is the group in between that I'm talking about, right? Queer Europeans of color, queer Muslims. So in the current narrative, we have an acceptance of queerness that is tolerable if it's perceived as being compatible with a neoliberal project that produces new forms of inclusion as well as exclusion. And with that comes a consensus that the group that needs to be excluded for the larger good at this moment are racialized others, which are summarized under the heading of Muslims. And it's particularly challenging to question this notion because it happens under the heading of colorblindness, under the idea that something like racialization doesn't even happen in Europe. It's a very common assumption that race is something that the US obsesses about, but that has no meaning in Europe, despite the fact that the very concept of race was invented in Europe and then used by Europeans to fundamentally reorder the world into a global race-based hierarchy that was violently implemented through colonialism and racial slavery. Nonetheless, continental Europe in particular, much more so than Britain, is very marginal in contemporary debates on race and racism, which is mostly due to two factors. The persistent idea that Europe is more advanced and liberal than any other part of the world, and the widespread equation of race with non-whiteness. And both come together in a narrative of colorblindness, which defines Europe as a space that is both raceless and necessarily white. One of the results of that is that there is no real challenge of this narrative from within a continental European theoretical framework which constantly externalizes race, that is, places it outside of the domain of what needs to be theorized. So the continental European left has produced no theory of racialization. Instead, class remains central, which is, of course, very ironic because class is very racialized in Europe. So as a result, race and with it racialization as a central means in the production of internal difference remains unspeakable, which is reflected in this language of second, third, fourth, and so on generation of migrants, right? Which is a constant externalization. We never talk about something that's internal to Europe, we talk about something that remains external for generation and generation. But while this racialization is unspeakable, it is certainly not invisible. On the contrary, this process of externalization relies on a continent-wide regime of recognized visual markers that construct non-whiteness, and in particular blackness, as non-Europeanness. And those were these pictures that I showed you. Blackface is something that is actually very popular in Europe, even though the narrative is there's nothing bad about it because there isn't this tradition of racism that we have in the US. This is one of the main sides of blackface, which is fashion. Vogue, for some reason, has this urge to repeatedly have series of black-faced models. This is Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete. I don't know if you know this figure. For most countries, Santa Claus comes from the North Pole, but for the Dutch, Santa Claus comes from Spain, which is why he has a little Moro with him, a little black guy, which is Black Pete. And this is something that is part of Dutch culture to the extent that come December 5th, people dress up in blackface everywhere. I lived in the Netherlands for 6 years, and it was insane, because you would encounter all these white people in blackface, and if you indicated that what they do is really a little bit fucked up, they would be extremely offended. And the particular Dutch variation of the reaction was, but I'm Dutch, I can't be racist. But this is something that is really true for all Europeans. Whatever I do is not racist because I'm European, which is sort of the inversion of this famous statement that Kant made about that guy who seemed to be quite reasonable, but he couldn't be because he was black, right? So, and of course, this is not something that comes out of nowhere. This comes out of a tradition that goes back as far as US blackface and is tied to colonialism. So racial representation were key to the visualization of colonialism, because colonialism, especially the second phase after the Berlin Conference in the late 19th century, went alongside a visualization of culture. The first really visual mass medium were postcards, right? Postcards what brought the world to people through pictures, for example, like this of the colonies, and then soon thereafter, film became popular, and colonial narratives were also part of early film. And again, what we find in this early period, of course, also is blackface. So this is nothing new. And what it indicates, rather than color blindness, is a kind of racial amnesia that is made possible through the active and constant erasure of this history of European racialization. And this erasure makes unspeakable the processes of internal racialization and the ways in which they are inseparable from the after effects of European colonialism and from neo-colonial economic structures that posit racialized communities increasingly as disposable populations, neither included nor expelled, instead forever stuck in the moment of disruption that their presence constitutes. And this is, of course, also a kind of racial amnesia that is reproduced culturally constantly in many, many sites, including the museum, which in some ways is a depository of racial memory. And this plays out in various ways, and the one that tends to get the most attention is the question of whether stolen artifacts, stolen during colonialism, should be given back. And the usual reaction to that is a discourse of universalism that claims that museums are a kind of extraterritorial, non-national space, right? The most recent example maybe was an op-ed by James Kuno, who is the CEO of the Getty Trust. And the Getty in Los Angeles, of course, is the wealthiest museum in the world. So very much part of racial capitalism. But Kunu's whole op-ed was an argument for or against the return of stolen art, right? And he said, among other things about museums, I quote, "By preserving and presenting examples of the world's cultures, they offer their visitors the world in all of its rich diversity. And in doing so, they protect and advance the idea of openness and integration in a changing world," end quote. So this rejection of nationalism in favor of an enlightened cosmopolitanism applies to art, but of course not to contemporary migrants, who are as irrelevant to high art universalism as the producers of the artworks that were stolen in the first place. Primitivism as an art movement not only is symptomatic of an appropriation of non-Western art as raw materials, which then is turned into true individualized art produced by white artists in the West, it's also inseparable from colonial violence. And this is something that continues into the present. The question, what constitutes art, what is ascribed with value, is as relevant to the art object as it is to the producers. So populations that are denied value cannot produce anything valuable. They can only produce raw material that is then elevated by others, which in some ways, of course, you could say is the story of Western art. And who is currently without value in Europe is pretty obvious. The economic collapse in parts of the European Union enhances a structural violence that was already present and that disproportionately affects certain communities through housing segregation, unemployment, incarceration, the collapse of the public school system. And the populations affected by that are very often Black, Muslim, and Roma communities. And while I recognize that there is a certain danger with the notion of people of color, which can erase the specifics of particular histories, I think in Europe it makes a lot of sense to address the interconnections and intersections between racialized communities, from Danish Palestinians to Black French or Hungarian Roma. The particular histories of colonialism, racism, and migration create intersections and overlaps between those groups, which result in shared spaces, shared cultures, and shared positionalities. But in dominant discourses, these connections of the groups with each other, but also of the groups to the larger European community, are denied. So this process of racial amnesia is also always something that goes on in the present. And in the present, you have a very strict division between Muslims as the internal other, the other that is already here, but still remains a foreign element because of its inherent cultural difference. On the other hand, you have Africans as the racial threat that is not yet here, but threatens to come in. The racial and demographic Goliath that threatens to overrun the tiny European David. And metaphors like this that represent Africans as uncontrollably reproducing masses are, of course, necessary to justify and normalize the incredibly violent migration regime that is taking place at the outer borders of Europe, right, where thousands of people die each year. I was born and raised in Germany, but now I live right on the US-Mexican border, the border between Global South, Global North, Latin America, Anglo-America, which is, and everybody knows that, a very violent border. but it is not as violent as the Southern European border. And I know that Europeans like to think of themselves as much less violent and crude than Americans. But that is a story that is not played out in reality. In reality, Europeans are much better than Americans, despite Hollywood, in selling a narrative of themselves that everybody believes. Germany has just been elected by the world, apparently. I don't know exactly who they asked, but Germany has been elected the best country in the world. So, right? If you get that confirmation, why should you change anything? So in my work, I've been interested in art and activism that aims at creating the conditions of speakability for these racialized communities, using strategies of resistance that originate in a diasporic queer of color identity. A queer diasporic positionality, in that sense, includes a population that does not necessarily share a common origin, however imaginary it might be, but a contemporary condition. Within this broadened understanding of diaspora, the concept is transformed from a term of temporal and spatial displacement focused on the past towards one of permanent productive dislocation directed at the future. To quote Gayatri Gopinath, suturing queer to diaspora recuperates those desires, practices, and subjectivities that are rendered impossible and unimaginable within conventional diasporic and nationalist imaginaries. A consideration of queerness, in other words, becomes a way to challenge nationalist ideologies by restoring the impure, inauthentic, non-reproductive potential of the notion of diaspora, end quote. So I just want to end by giving you a couple of examples of these queer diasporic strategies. This is a Dutch group called Strange Fruit that was founded in the late 80s, and the name Strange Fruit already, like Salon Oriental, draws on various discourses. It's a reference, of course, to the Billie Holiday song that references lynching in the US, and if you heard about the Ferguson case, this is also something that is not happening in the past, but in the present. But it also references, obviously, the notion of queer people as strange fruit. So this is sort of very characteristic for the strategy of this group, which included members of Caribbean, African, Asian, Middle Eastern background, gay men, lesbians, trans people, and practice a kind of fusionist approach that is in many ways characteristic for this attempt to create a presence not in a separate identifiable space, but wherever they are. So these were people who also did performances in queer clubs and things like that. They used Surinamese traditions of storytelling to replace notions of coming out that are very much individualized in Western discourse and turned it into something that is both collective and also something that is a repetition, that is not. In the dominant notion of coming out, the coming out is the big turning point. Once you come out, nothing remains the same, right? You change completely from being in the closet to being out, but that's not really how it is. Not for many people of color, but also, I think, not for many white people. It's really something that is a much more circular and fluid process. So this is something that was expressed in their way of dealing with narrations of gender, national, ethnic, and sexual identity. This is a current group that does something quite similar called Lesbians of Color, who are active in France, also a multi-ethnic group. This is an example of the activists that I see as queering notions of identity, even though they themselves do not identify as queer. This is a poster taken from the election campaign of a young Danish Palestinian woman called Asma Abdul Hamid, who is a socialist feminist and devout Muslim. And she was a candidate for the Socialist Party in Denmark in 2007, I think. Which was something that was very controversial in society in general, but also very much in the Socialist Party. The idea that she could be explicitly, and as they felt, aggressively Muslim by, for example, wearing the hijab, and at the same time call herself feminist was something that was questioned by a lot of people. And what is interesting about her case is that she was not silenced. Very often the discourse around the hijab is a discourse where liberals feel, and progressives feel, they have to speak for Muslim women because they can't speak for themselves. Because the inability to speak for themselves is visualized by the hijab. If you see a woman wearing hijab, you already know that she can't speak for herself. That whatever she says will be maybe a result of her brainwashing, but not an independent opinion. And Asma Abdul Hamid was very interesting because she very eloquently and very persistently challenged that notion and would not be silenced. And she also was very interesting in because of the coalitions she formed. So this is an event at Dunkelbar, which is a queer club in Copenhagen, and again, the kind of club that would be a site for the performances of Salon Oriental. So a club that was frequented by drag queens, by trans people, but the kinds of queers that do not fit that model of the good, neoliberal, gay person. And those were the people that she thought out alliances with. And this poster says, everybody talks about her, now you can talk with her, which in many ways is sort of the motto of what she was doing. And this example finally is one of the examples of hip-hop artists who are very important, as I mentioned, because of their way of using inauthentic positions to voice a challenge to the norm. This French group, La Rumeur, became famous in part because in the liner notes to their first CD, they, or the young man here, May, compared his experience growing up in a Parisian outer city and facing daily police violence with the police violence that was experienced by the generation of his parents, among other things, in the Paris massacre of '61, where the Parisian police killed hundreds of peacefully demonstrating Algerians. And that was a mass murder that was repressed for a very long time. Officially repressed, but then again, there's always the return of the repressed, right? This kind of haunting that you see in graffitis like this. Here is where Algerians are killed. So what happened after they made this explicit connection with the murders of '61 and contemporary police violence was that they were sued by the French government for insulting the police forces. And that was a trial that was going on for, I think, a decade, because the government consistently lost, but they always went back. Because I think it was not only about a legal case, it was about symbolic power and about controlling the discourse. So it was very important for them, for the government, to silence this narrative, which was a narrative from the perspective of those who are the targets of this denied and repressed racial violence in Europe, which is very different than Michael Haneke's Cachet, which also deals with this story, but deals with it from the perspective of the perpetrator. And rather than being taken to court, of course, he received the Golden Palm at Cannes. So this is a difference between provocative, brave art and violent noise, which is also a separation that is very often made between white activists and people of color. So what is happening in the work of all those people that I presented is a queering or creolization of narratives that works at the intersection of concepts and disciplines and opens up the potential of expressing exactly the positionality deemed impossible, namely that, as I said, of Europeans of color, foregrounding their transgressive strategies of resistance often downplayed in culturalist debates around Europe's migration problem. So in order to change this narrative, what is necessary is the construction of different archives that need to be based on the experience of the marginalized, silenced communities who don't have any presence in the existing dominant archives of Europeanness. So what these artists and activists do in some sense is to create an alternative archive of Europeanness. And I want to end with this group that you can see here because they do it in some ways very explicitly, historically. This is a poster from an event by a German group called Kanakatak, which was most active from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. And they have roots in a variety of movements. Some of the members actually were part of the Salon Oriental collective, others were hip-hop artists. And this was a group that rejected the notion of multiculturalism long before the German chancellor declared it dead, and instead insisted in a kind of conversation that connected various excluded communities, which is reflected in their name. Kanake is a very common derogatory German term for foreigners, or rather for racialized people. It is a term that describes people who are seen as not belonging. So it does not apply to all foreigners. And not everybody it is applied to is a foreigner. It is a very racialized term, and it has its roots in German colonialism. It is actually originally a term meaning human in the language, in a Southern Pacific language. So Germans in the early 20th century and late 19th century had colonies in New Guinea and Samoa. So while it's not really possible to exactly trace how the term entered the German language, it seems very likely that it was this colonial experience that first brought the term Kanake to Germany and introduced it as a racialized insult. And of course, people who use the term now have no idea of that history. Germany's colonial past has only recently been discovered by academia and is very much considered as something that is situated in the past, even though, for example, the last remains of Herero killed in the first German genocide in Namibia in 1907 were only returned to Namibia a couple of years ago. Before that, they were part of a German museum collection. So what the colloquial use of Kanake shows is that this process of racial suppression, of racial amnesia, is a process that can never be fully successful. There are always ways in which this repressed past bubbles to the surface. And very often it is in these violent ways, such as becoming a term to control the new racialized German population. And by appropriating and explicitly using that term, Kanaka Tak, and of course Kanaka especially in connection with attack, creates a certain kind of making the unspeakable speakable that breaks with this tradition of silencing and being silenced. And this is another archival source that shows that, of course, Germany has a colonial history, a history that you can trace if you want to. So this is a picture from the first big Kanaka Talk event where they use a symbol, a visual symbol of migration that is again legible across national borders, right? Most people will recognize this kind of cheap bag that you can find everywhere and that is used by people who migrate across border, but also, for example, who migrate from the countryside to the city. So they created a kind of verbal counter-discourse through the naming of certain things, but also a kind of visual counter-discourse. And how am I doing with time? Okay, so then I'll come to the conclusion nonetheless. But what activists like Kanakatak, like Salon Oriental, like La Rumeur or Strange Fruit do is being in opposition to the dominant attempt at creating a common, coherent narrative of national identity, of European identity. Instead, they do what Susan Suleiman calls a crisis of memory. That is a conflict over, I quote, the interpretation and public understanding of an event firmly situated in the past, but whose after effects are still deeply felt. And these after effects could also be described as Glissant's points of entanglement at which differences and discrepancies were first suppressed and externalized. And again, the inversion of these points of entanglement could be this kind of loop that is created in this activism or in hip-hop, where the aim is not to return to that point and make it all better and create a new story, but to move away from the notion that there is one point that defines how the story goes. And Glissant, I think, is very interesting for European activism, in part because he described a certain strategy present among Caribbean activists exactly because they could not claim a sense of authentic belonging to the land that is very dominant in stories of domination, but also in stories of resistance. So what do you do if you can't claim belonging to the space where you are? And this is something that is explored in Glissant's notion of creolization, but I think it's also applicable to the European activism that rejects the notion of sacred roots of Europe and instead replaces it sorry. Replaces it with the notion of situational communities. So what I'm talking about really are situational communities, which means that they allow for more openness than other formations, but it also means that they are less stable. So there is not necessarily a particular way that is laid out by those groups that we all have to follow. It was a constellation that came together and then morphed into something else, which again, of course, is very close to the notion of queerness as it is represented by, for example, José Muñoz and his understanding of disidentification, which is a kind of third way between identification and rejection, being inside or outside of the system. It is being inside the system, but always being displaced in the system. So where was I? Okay, so this notion of going against coherence and externalization is present in Glissant's work, but it's also, of course, present in the work of women of color feminism since the 1970s and earlier, which pointed out that these constructs of pure racial, national, or religious identities always depend on heteronormative conceptualizations of gender and sexuality that are no less restrictive in their negation of what is not acceptable, as in this discourse of colorblindness with which they are interwoven. So this whole process could be called a queering of ethnicity that is employed by racialized minorities who all work against the attempt to cohere them out of existence, resisting not only their erasure from the contemporary European landscape, but also from its past, and has the dual function of inserting European minorities into the ongoing debate around the continent's identity and of reclaiming their place in its history, with the creation of alternative archives working as a bridge between the two. And since the dogma of colorblindness is centrally built on silencing, on making certain identities, processes, and structures unspeakable, a number of alternative languages emerged, all circumventing the mandate to silence by making specifically European taboos around race speakable, which is what happened in a lot of early hip-hop, but also in names like Kanaka Tak. These sonic, performative, and visual languages use the haunting presence of repressed histories to map an alternative spatio-temporal European landscape, building Glissant's poetics of relation, or in Casey Cohen's terms, a politics where one's relation to power and not some homogenized identity is privileged in determining one's political comrades, in the process destabilizing naturalized understandings of time and space that work in the interests of particular groups, recovering impossible alternatives, or, to riff on Audre Lorde, they are the way we help give name to the nameless so that it can be thought. Thank you very much.